This is the Raid Point Guide. This video guide will be on all the factors that do and do not affect the size and type of major threats in Rimworld. Major threats means raids, manhunter packs, mech clusters, infestations, and a few others. Many players call the formula to determine the size and type of major threats raid points. Raid points are also known as base points, threat points, and fun points. Wealth points. The game gives the player an amount of raid points based on wealth. Generally, more wealth means more wealth points. I have a separate video on all things wealth and wealth management. Here's a link to it. Pawn points. The game counts colonists and combat animals and gives an amount of points. More colonists and more combat animals means more pawn points. Colonist pawn points scale with wealth. Wealth and pawn points are added together. This raid point subtotal is then multiplied by 3 different factors. The difficulty factor is a multiplier based on your chosen difficulty level. The starting factor is an early game grace period. The first 40 days of a colony is made slightly easier. The adaptation factor generally makes the game easier or harder based on how well Rimworld thinks you are doing. That's the entire formula. That's how Rimworld determines the size and type of major threats. Wealth points plus pawn points, added together. Then multiplied by the difficulty factor, multiplied by the starting factor, multiplied by the adaptation factor. This raid point video is part 1 of 2. Part 1 is wealth management and wealth. The simplified version of that entire video is more wealth means larger threats. We then learned that wealth is more complicated than that. This video, part 2 on raid points, is the same. We have this formula that is useful and simplified, but there are tons of details and nuances. Disclaimers. I will try to explain everything practical in a way that doesn't require any math. I will also provide the math, but you do not need to know the math. You should play however you find fun. I consider some of the information in this guide as exploitive. Whether you do or don't do the concepts from this guide is entirely up to you. I'm not suggesting you do or don't do anything. My intention is to explain how things work. Hopefully you can use this information to have more fun. What is fun is up to you. You do you. There are a few topics in this guide I don't know. I also have probably made some mistakes in places. I'll do my best to collect updates and corrections in the comments and my website. Any help or comments you can provide are greatly appreciated. Notably missing from the raid point formula are research, time, and storyteller. Rimworld does not consider your locked or unlocked research in any way when calculating raid points. Time is not a factor. One could say that the starting factor is time, but that factor does nothing after day 40. One could also say the adaptation factor is a time factor, but that factor only rises if your colony doesn't have accidents, and only scales up so far. When I say time is not a factor, I mean if your colony is 2 colonists in a simple shack, eating rice and researching, you will have tiny raids forever. This base, on Losing is Fun, will never get sieges, sappers, nor breachers. Even after 1,000 years, this base will never see raids larger than about 10 standard human enemies. The storytellers Cassandra, Phoebe, and Randy each use this raid point formula. After raid points are calculated, Randy Random will then randomly adjust raid points up or down up to 50%. Here are some of the potentially practical things you will learn from this guide. Wealth management is so effective because wealth gets factored twice. Consider arresting or anesthetizing any pawns before placing them in the crypto sleep or biosculptor. Colonists in these two do count towards pawn points, but prisoners don't. You may not want early game self-tamed large animals. Combat animal pawn points don't scale with wealth. At the start of the game, a Thrumbo can be worth more than 3 colonists in raid points. In the late stages of the game, that same thrumbo might be only worth 1/5 of a colonist in raid points. Extremely small caravans can be very effective. Caravans with one person, one horse, and below 10,000 total wealth mean ambushes can only be extremely small and easily defeated. The Rimworld gods truly appreciate sacrifices. Sacrificing or murdering nearly everyone that trusts you can be surprisingly effective. Guests, visitors, colonists you don't like, Abasia joiners. Kill them all and the game will reward you with smaller threats. We'll get to how and why we came to those conclusions. There are other things to learn too. Murdering nearly everyone you meet in the name of game mechanic abuse may not be fun for you. That's okay. I'm not suggesting you should or should not do that. You can and should play however you find fun. Raid points are visible with development mode and some mods. For development mode, options, development mode. Open the view settings, third button. Check right storyteller. Back to the main screen. Click the inspector tool, looks like a magnifying glass. Raid points are called base points here. Alternatively, history button, looks like a book. Graph tab. Select the debug tab. This graph shows a history of your raid points and they are labeled as fun points. Also, at some places in the game's code, there are variables like default threat points now. That's also usually raid points. Raid points, base points, fun points, threat points, they all mean the same thing. Let's add a bit more detail. So step 1 of the raid point formula is to calculate wealth and pawn points, then add them together. Step 2, we multiply this subtotal by the 3 factors. The order you multiply these all together does not matter. Step 3, limit the result to be from 35 to 10,000. The 35 point minimum exists, so Rimworld can always send one naked raider with a knife or club. I personally believe that the raid point limit of 10,000 exists because generally many players don't enjoy the slow performance of extremely large game raids, but that's just my personal opinion. Raids at the soft cap maximum of 10,000 points are roughly 200 tribals, 100 outlanders or pirates, 66 scythers, or 25 centipedes. Once you start seeing raids of about that size, you are at the raid points off cap. At that point, there is no point in managing your wealth, no point in managing your colonist count, or anything else unless you can get back below that 10,000 soft cap. Step 4. If applicable, either the random factor or the quest factor applies. Major threats can exceed the 10,000 raid point soft cap due to either the Randy random storyteller or via quests, which means that Randy can potentially send a 15,000 raid point threat. The Randy factor does not apply to quests, but quests can still go over the 10,000 raid point soft cap. Quests can vary up to 30% up or down on any storyteller. Also, 2-star quests means double raid points. 3-star quests mean triple raid points. 4-star quests don't adjust raid points, but they are game-ending quests. Raid points are calculated separately for each colony and each caravan. If you have 2 colonies, and one is big and one is small, the big one will get big threats, and the small one will get small threats. All the raid point multiplying factors are shared. Difficulty starting and adaptation factor are shared across all colonies and caravans. Raid points only affect the type and size of major threat. Raid points do not affect the frequency of major threats. More raid points does not mean more major threats. More raid points means that the threats that do arrive larger and theoretically more dangerous. The schedule of major The schedule and frequency of major threats is solely determined by your choice of storyteller. Check out my storyteller guide linked here. So, step 1 is the Rimworld storyteller decides to send a major threat. Raid points are not considered. Step 2, Rimworld decides which type of major threat to send. Raid points are considered now. Some major threats are gated behind a raid point amount. Raids like one naked person with a knife or club are virtually always possible. Here's a chart of some breakpoints of when major threats become possible. Step 3. Nearly all major threats are scaled based on raid points. For nearly all major threats, the more raid points means the more enemies. Step 4. Some threat types adjust the size of the threat. For example, relative to a standard immediate attack raid, a breach raid will be shrunk up to 50%. Think of raid points as bad dude money. Cassandra has 300 raid points. Cassandra buys 5 thugs who each cost 60 raid points. Then she tells them to beat up your stuff. Here's the raid point cost of many enemies. Feel free to pause here. I'll also have the picture up on my website. These costs that mean that if you get attacked by 3 mech scythers, which cost 150 raid points each, you probably had a little over 450 raid points. For estimating purposes, I consider these raiders to be the standard human raiders. These are all worth about 60 raid points. If you get attacked by 10 standard raiders, you have about 600 raid points. That means that when you start getting raids of about 7 standard humans, then the possibility of infestations, mech clusters, defoliatorships, and psychic dronerships exist. When you start getting raids of about 11 or 12 standard humans, then you can get hit with sieges, sappers, breaches. Those numbers aren't exact, but those are reasonable guesstimations of your current raid points. If you're using Randy Random as your storyteller, he has that 50% factor, and that makes the estimations very, very rough. If you want the exact numbers, you should either use development mode, mods, or insanely, you can calculate raid points by hand. Let's get to how to do that. Wealth points. Generally, more wealth means more raid points. First, Rimworld totals up the total value of everything that counts as wealth. Then, Rimworld converts colony wealth into storyteller wealth. Storyteller wealth mostly means building wealth only counts as 50%. There's a whole video on wealth, storyteller wealth, and how it all works here. Rimworld takes this storyteller wealth amount to a chart that is buried in the game's code. The storyteller wealth amount is shown on the left. The raid points given are shown on the right. So, at 400,000 storyteller wealth, you are given 2,400 raid points. For values in between the shown numbers, raid points essentially uses a weighted average. Exact values are calculated using a complex equation. For values off the top or off the bottom of the chart, you simply use the numbers on the end of the chart. The chart stops at 1 million. At 1 million storyteller wealth, or even at 250 billion storyteller wealth, you are given 4,200 raid points. The first wealth point is given at a tiny bit over 14,000 storyteller wealth. However, we will also see that wealth also counts in pawn points. The value of a colonist pawn points scales with wealth. We will see that calculation has a similar chart, and that chart starts at 10,000 storyteller wealth. That's why wealth management is such a big deal. Wealth gets factored twice. When wealth goes up, both wealth points and pawn points both go up. So, in summary, more wealth means more pawn points. Wealth below 10,000 does not matter. Wealth above 1 million only counts at 1 million. Wealth hits twice because wealth also counts in pawn points. The exact math gets complicated. There is no practical reason for a Rimworld player to know how to do this part. I'm intentionally going to go fast, but this is exactly how the math is done. Here's a silly example base. Here's colony wealth. Here's building wealth. Here's storyteller wealth. Here's the wealth point chart. This is the linear interpolation formula. Numbers into the formula. Solve the formula. Done. The Rimworld code calls all humans, living mechs, and animals pawns. Pawn points are based on colonists and combat animals. Pawn points are going to get complex. Colonists contribute towards raid points in two separate ways. First, their market value goes into wealth. Wealth goes into storyteller wealth, which goes into wealth points. Then, second, nearly every colonist also contributes pawn points simply for existing. A bionic super soldier and a brain-scarred colonist may contribute different amounts of wealth, but their pawn points will likely be the same. These pawn points scale up with wealth. Every tamed animal's market value goes into wealth. A combat animal is any animal that can learn the attack skill. Animals that cannot learn the attack skill are not combat animals and do not contribute any pawn points. Combat animals contribute pawn points that are 8% of their combat power. That combat power is only listed in dev mode or the XML files. Combat animal pawn points do not consider wealth, training, nor age of the animal. Early game combat animals may contribute a relatively huge amount of points. Now we're going to go through some examples and show all the numbers. You don't need to know how to do the math, but seeing some done may help give a practical understanding. This example base has a bunch of pawns and the same wealth numbers as before. Here's the chart for colonist pawn points. Wealth is shown on the left and pawn points are awarded on the right. For example, if you have 400,000 storyteller wealth, then each colonist is worth 140 raid points. Again, knowing how to do the math isn't important. We're just going to skip to the answer, and that's a little over 31 points per colonist in this example base. Colonist and evil colonist are exactly the same and generally normal colonists. Their market value, the market value of their clothing, inventory, and weapons all goes into wealth. That's already included in that storyteller wealth number. In addition, they both contribute pawn points, which we calculated to be about 31. This super soldier has tons of skills and some bionics. Their wealth is already included. They also contribute the regular pawn points of 31. The brain dead colonist has severe brain damage, no legs, and one arm. Their wealth, again, already included, and they also contribute regular pawn points 31. We have a slave. Their wealth is already included. They only contribute 75% of regular pawn points. Guests, temporary colonists from another faction, do not count towards raid points. Their market value, inventory, weapon, clothing do not count towards wealth. They do not contribute pawn points. Prisoner and an imprisoned colonist. One is captured from another faction, and one is an imprisoned current faction member who we could release back to being a colonist at any time. Both of their market values and items are already in the wealth number. Neither contributes any pawn points. Beryl died. Beryl is a corpse. Corpses have market value, and that goes into wealth. A corpse does not contribute any pawn points. The colony has a few tamed animals. All tamed animals' market value goes into wealth, and it's already counted. The bull is a farm animal. It cannot learn the attack skill. It contributes no pawn points. The Yorkshire Terrier can learn the attack skill and is therefore a combat animal. It contributes 8% of its combat power as pawn points. The Terrier has a combat power of 30. That means 2.4 pawn points. The tortoise can be zoned, but it cannot be trained to attack. It contributes no pawn points. The fully trained adult Thrumbo can learn the attack skill. A Thrumbo has 500 combat power. That means 40 pawn points. This baby Thrumbo has not learned the attack skill, but it can learn the attack skill. It also contributes 40 pawn points. Now we have calculated both wealth points and pawn points. Let's do all the math real fast. First, we take colony wealth and subtract out half of building wealth. Now we have storyteller wealth. Take storyteller wealth to this chart. Because storyteller wealth is between the defined numbers, we essentially take a weighted average. That's called linear interpolation, and here's the formula again. And here's the answer for wealth points. We also take storyteller wealth to this pawn point chart to learn the points per colonist. Same formula, here's the points per colonist. This example base has 4.75 colonists. Regular and evil colonist, super soldier, and brain dead each count as a colonist. The slave counts as 3/4. The guest, the corpse, and the 2 prisoners do not count as colonists. Colonist count can be multiplied by the points per colonist. We also have some animals who generate pawn points based on their combat power. The adult and baby Thrumbo and the Yorkie all contribute pawn points because they are combat animals. They can learn the attack skill. The zonable turtle and the bull do not contribute pawn points. Now we total up all these pawn points. So now we've got wealth points and we have pawn points and we add them together. Next, we would multiply this subtotal by 3 different factors: the difficulty factor, the starting factor, and the adaptation factor. We'll talk about all those 3 factors in a moment, but for now, it is possible to turn them all off. I've done so. So we've calculated raid points to be roughly 521.772. Development mode is showing raid points to be 522. We did it. Great job.